modern day League of Legends, we are used to players complaining about how broken the newest champions are. We love to reminisce about the glory days of League, though often through rose-tinted nostalgia goggles. You see, back in the glory days, Riot would never release champions like Senna, Qiyana, Set, or Aphelios. These new champions are omnipresent in today's meta because more often than not they are given all of the tools to succeed. They have overloaded and frustrating kits. Don't even get the conversation started on how many times it also feels like they don't even know what they want to do with certain champions. Let's just take Senna. Is she an AD carry, a support? It almost feels like even they don't know. They just need to remove some of these champions from the free week rotation, nerf them into the ground so that they're never viable, and wait for years for them to be finally reworked. Alright, okay, maybe that's a little too far. I mean, they can't just do that. Or can they? While it feels as if they only released toxic and unfair champions in 2020, historically there was a champion that rivaled these new beasts, a champion that was so unfun to play against that even the developers were trying to hide him away from the rest of the game and discourage any new players from learning him. It left him without a home, in no place, lonely and forgotten. Because of him being intentionally gutted out of viability, it almost felt like you were forbidden to play a champion. If you take a look at champions that people hate the most in Season 10, such as this group of misfits, you often see their champion spotlight's like to dislike ratio not being the best. But overall, they're mostly receiving positive reception, anywhere from 70% or higher. Even Aphelios, who has become the new Yasuo and is Reddit's new demon child, still holds a pretty okay ratio. I figured only one other champion could rival as much hate. Surely, Teemo's champion spotlight would have the worst like to dislike ratio. And while it's not great, it pales in comparison to Yorick. Let's go back to 2011. When doing these champion documentaries, we usually begin right at a champion's concept, and then we go into why they were flawed, what problems they might have had, and how the champion was reworked or changed later on down the road in order to fix these ever-longing issues. Rarely though do we go into why some of these older champions, specifically around the years 2010 and 2011, seem to have so many different issues. Wukong was released in 2011 with plenty of gameplay flaws and a lack of a true fluid design, whether or not he's supposed to be a jungler or a top laner. And finally, nearly a decade later, we get to see these brand new Wukong changes just recently, 9 years in the making. When looking at a timeline of League of Legends and Riot Games as a company, it is possible to piece together a potential reason for these flaws. Yorick was released in June of 2011, but earlier that year Riot Games was purchased by Tencent, the Chinese conglomerate, for a price of $400 million, giving them a 93% stake in the company. Later on, Tencent would just go ahead and buy the rest of the company to have full ownership. Those fancy business words just mean a company who is using its money and power to purchase other companies so they get their money and power. They're like one big investor, and Tencent is one of the biggest companies that has ever existed. Even though Tencent's video game division is not actually a developer, they don't code for League of Legends or other games that they own, they are still technically the biggest video game company in the world. Tencent owns a few games you might have heard of. They own full control of Riot Games, who makes that small indie game known as League of Legends. Tencent also owns 80% of Grinding Gear, the company that makes Path of Exile. They also own 40% of Epic Games. I think they make some kind of shooter game. Pretty sure that's like a mobile game though. And speaking of mobile games, they also happen to own 84% of Supercell, the Finnish developer behind Clash of Clans. Oh yeah, and they also have stake in all of these games too. The point of this part of the story is not to tell you how much Tencent owns and controls your life as a gamer, as all of your favorite games are eventually going to succumb to their big dollar signs. No. Rather, this is to give you an idea of the motivation and goals behind game developers after they see a massive increase in capital. More specifically, this is to tell you about Tencent's money and the fact that they want more of it. When Riot was bought for $400 million, this was a massive move by Tencent, but it could still be seen as a huge risk. What if they never get their investment money back? After all, this is a free-to-play game, and if you told your friends that you're investing $400 million into a video game that the developers say, hey, come and play for free, they might tell you this is the worst trade deal in the history of trade deals maybe ever. The nice thing for Tencent is that League of Legends does indeed have a business model, and it has everything to do with the champions themselves. In this game, it's not technically required to spend any money in order to be competitive, but the more good skins and champions that come out, the more likely your customers will feel inclined and sometimes pressured into spending their money. During this time, it's very likely that the pressure from the devs at Riot to make new champions was at an all-time high, as the higher-ups at Tencent knew that this acquisition was brand new and they were looking to make as much money as possible. More champions equals more money equals more growth, and more growth equals better game. This sounds great, but in practice you're seriously going to miss the mark on quality. Let's take a time frame of when they released champions. For example, let's start around late 2010. Even though the purchase wasn't made public until February of 2011, we can speculate that Riot knew of this offer for months, if not way longer from before, but of course the legal details, contracting, and funding all had to be figured out, which of course can take a very long time. Let's then extend the timeline until around 6 months after it went public to give us basically 1 year of champion releases from late 2010 until late 2011. The schedule for releasing new champions during these days was something that players probably liked at the time, because we used to get a new champion every 2 weeks. In fact, the release of Brand was only 11 days after releasing Lee Sin. To be fair, we did get a few smash hits such as Orianna and Lee Sin, but the number of rushed, broken, almost incomplete champions on this list is quite the trip. Aurelia and LeBlanc have needed many different reworks over the years, with LeBlanc's day one release being so overpowered that she was immediately hotfixed. Swain had to be fully reworked many years later because his original release was not only a very hard to balance champion, but his champion spotlight was quite literally false advertising. Skarner has had many issues, being reworked multiple times as well, including the Juggernaut rework, which is something that deserves an entire video on its own. Wukong was finally reworked after nearly 9 years just a few days ago, so it's about time for that. And Karma and Trundle were released during this time, two champions who have these traditional skins, which were given to champions after their reworks because their original state was so poorly designed, so badly executed, that Riot openly admitted those champions were a mistake and needed a redo. Also, in this time frame is our friend, and the main character in this story, which is Yorick. Our friend Yorick was released in June of 2011. His design was largely a new feeling, as they would take a risk with him being the first one of their champions to be designed around using and controlling some summoned minions. His theme was all about being a grave-digging necromancer, one that lets his ghouls do some of the fighting while he can still dish out some decent damage on his own. And this is important, and they note this for a key reason, as rioters talk about how it can be very tough making a summoning-only character. That can lead to a binary pattern of gameplay where either they have their minions up and they win, or they don't have their minions up and you win. Giving Yorick more tools to do things without them also means that it's not a simple yes or no question whether or not he will win the duel. Yorick's ghouls all doing different things also meant that his skill and learning curve tied to them, with the player using the right combination of spells at certain times. Using the correct type of minion and the correct type of ghoul for the situation could reward you with some extra awesome results and make you feel like a true master over your minions rather than just spamming your buttons. All of this seems great to explain in text, but how did it actually come out? Well, let's start with the previously mentioned champion spotlight. This video came out one day after his release and was met with some of the worst, if not the worst, reception on any of their champion spotlights. The general consensus was that Yorick was just terrible, super underpowered, and the champion spotlight kinda made it try to sound like he was really good when he wasn't. But the thing is, Freak sounds so uninterested doing this that I don't even really think they put in any effort into making the video.
I get jumped by LeBlanc while low on health. Unfortunately, I die, but thanks to Omen of Death, I have full control of my abilities when I respawn, so I get revenge before timing out. We catch two of our opponents in the upper jungle. I catch LeBlanc with Omen of Pestilence, and she dies to Needley's Javelin Toss. Later on, we turret dive onto Vayne. My burst damage from Omen of Pestilence and Omen of Famine get us the kill underneath the turret.
What's interesting is that in the champion spotlight, it's obvious that they are pushing him to be a top laner and that's his main role, but once he came out, the community felt very awkward playing him. They didn't know if he was supposed to be a top laner, a jungler, a mid laner even, he just didn't really seem to fit in. While this can easily be attributed to bad champion design, oftentimes a champion doesn't really have a place because they are just straight up underpowered and their numbers are too low, and that was kind of the case with Yorick. One patch after his release, he was immediately buffed. These buffs turned out to be a little too good for Riot's liking, so they then nerfed him the following patch. This back and forth and not knowing what they want to do with the champion would foreshadow the rest of his history. Anyway, after the players got used to the champion with some quality buffs and a bit more practice, it was clear that he was going to be a top laner. This champion clearly had a kit that could compete despite him having very little crowd control, because he could make up for that in a 1v1 by having an awesome amount of sustain. However, they ran into a problem with his kit. If you wanted to win your lane and dominate, you usually needed a blue buff because the champion had very serious mana issues. Riot would then address his mana problems directly through some changes, but the players would also discover the build path that would cement his place into the Hall of Broken, Manamune, and Frozen Heart. Having this much mana on top of the cooldown reduction and tankiness from Frozen Heart essentially eliminated all of Yorick's weaknesses in the early to mid parts of the game. Sure, late game he could still be kited and his damage would fall off, but there's an old Yorick meme about how he used to walk into a bar and there was no counter. And undoubtedly, this was pretty true. He simply stepped all over you with his mana items, and it wouldn't be a matter of can you 1v1 Yorick, it was a matter of can your champion make it out of lane only down 40 CS instead of 100 CS down against Yorick. Arguably, he's the biggest lane bully that we've ever seen and maybe even the best mid-game duelist we've ever seen as well. The sustain along with strong early damage just couldn't be matched, and it was only a matter of time before his pushing and healing strategy would overrun your lane and you were forced to give up your tower or get dove and give it up anyway. On top of that, junglers would try to camp Yorick and set him behind, but the threat of being 1v2'd was so high that it would always be a risk. Junglers and the power of jungle champions during this era was just much lower than it is today, and in general players have become leaps and bounds better at the game. Nowadays this kit would still be an incredible lane bully, but an excellent Lee Sin or Nidalee player in Season 10 would probably camp the Yorick as hard as possible and set him back so their laner could breathe. This is a concept that was understood in 2011, but was less likely to happen. The main drivers behind his ridiculous laning phase were his W and his E. Omen of Famine was the most nerfed part about his old kit, having a couple of different iterations. Balancing this level of sustain and his war of attrition proved nearly impossible. If you don't nerf this ability, then he is the king of top lane, but if you nerf it even slightly, well, that's the only good part of his kit, and if it gets hit, his lackluster late game and practically zero crowd control basically leaves the champion without anything to offer. Omen of Pestilence and Omen of War love to work together to make Yorick a very frustrating champion to get away from and to catch, with his Q giving him movement speed and his W applying a slow. One very peculiar thing about the champion as well is that he was meant to build AD, and for the most part, yes he did, but his abilities did magic damage, so you had a champion that did a lot of damage through auto attacks and building a lot of AD, But if you wanted to build against him and stack some armor, which is totally what you think would be reasonable, well, then if you look, the things that are killing you are doing magic damage. That in the video game industry is just what we call bad design. We haven't even got to talk about his ultimate yet. Omen of Death allowed him to either summon a version of himself or a teammate, and this would still persist even if you died, so long as the Yorick casts it before he dies. This meant that even if you were finally able to get Yorick low, and by some miracle you could 1v1 him because he either messed up and you were able to kill him, well, guess what? He can reanimate himself for 10 seconds and get a return kill on you. In spite of this, I think his ultimate was the coolest part about the old Yorick, and it would have a couple of different strategies and team comps that you could build around this ability. This was by far the most interesting thing that he had to offer, but we will get into that in a little bit. Solo Q and the rest of the community would pick up on the Yorick hype train, and we would even see him take the YouTube scene by storm. In Donkey's Escape from Elo Hell video, he talks about how he learned to counterpick his lane to gain an advantage, and he was using a counterpick website. Funny enough, if you actually look closely, almost every single champion says weak against Yorick. He also shows his match history where traditionally he was not known for playing Yorick, but rather champions like Wukong, yet on Yorick he was practically winning every single game. Dyrus uploaded videos to his YouTube channel talking about how strong Yorick was, and the Rain Man, the OG top laner for TSM, talked about how he was abusing Yorick to climb to rank 1 on one of his vlogs. He personally discovered how good Yorick was after he played his main, which was Teemo, and he got absolutely clobbered by a Yorick, so he decided to pick it up and learn the champion. So at this point, everybody figured out that he was completely impossible to lane against, and during the Ignite meta of top lane, this effect was only amplified. Top lane was known as the 1v1 lane back then, the island, the place where you pick the strongest possible champion you can master, and you try to outduel your opponent. Bad news is, unless your champion was Yorick, you probably lost. During these days, we would see some consecutive nerfs to him, with some of them being quite substantial hits. It's also not quite understood when exactly this happened, but after years of playing the game, some players noticed they had literally never seen Yorick in the free week rotation. The free rotation is used to allow newer players and veterans alike to try out a brand new champion that they don't own. They can play them while they're still on a free week in normal games to try to find out if they like to play that champion. It gives them a chance to say, hey, I really like that champ, but I'm not sure if I want to spend my hard-earned either real money or in-game currency on them, so let me give them a try. I might even find a new main. When you're first starting the game and you're a noob, this feature is really important because you do not have the IP in order to buy every champion. But what about Yorick? It's speculated that him and Poppy were removed from the free week rotation to deter players from playing him because ultimately Riot knew his kit was very unhealthy. They knew he was broken. They were quite literally trying to hide the champion away from the game, almost ashamed that they ever even put him out there. After he ran victory laps through top lane for several months during 2011 and 2012, Riot would gut him, effectively removing him from viability for several years. Blatantly, they didn't want this champion to work. They did not want him to work his way back into the meta, and he was reserved to be reworked and never even allowed to exist in his old state. Unfortunately, this waiting period for his rework would go on for far too long. As you probably know, we wouldn't get his rework until 2016, more than 5 years after he came out. But in 2013, there was a Riot post explaining that a Rioter was working on Yorick's rework and it was in development. They were going to do something big with his kit, but we never got to see this. His lane dominant days were over, and the only thing that made the champion viable was completely removed. But if we fast forward to 2015, something amazing happened with Yorick. In my video covering the history of the best off-meta picks, I covered Unicorns of Love and Vizicsacsi's infamous Yorick game. UOL was the European LCS ragtag group of young talent that had everything to prove and nothing to lose, and they were often known for picking off-meta champions. Chachi, their top laner, had played champions like Poppy in the past, their jungler Kikis played Shaco and Udyr, and Power of Evil invented mid-lane Varus, something that would become popular for years to come after he first pulled it out on stage. In one of the best and most exciting professional League of Legends games anyone has ever seen, UOL pulled out a Yorick top lane, something that we had not seen in the pros for a very long time.
5-second cooldown at rank 5.
Oh my
which
word,
obviously
what
is
is
a lot of slows.
happening?
This is crazy. I mean, this patch, man. Now we're running an old school Yorick Cassiopeia composition where you have this suicide mid laner who just goes bazookas on the enemy team, and then you resurrect her once she dies. I mean, this is a Yorick top lane now from Vizicsacsi.
The casters, Deficio and Quickshot, spoke about the Unicorns running an old school Yorick comp. One of the few unspoken strengths of the old Yorick was his ultimate. What made him so broken was his laning phase and sustain, but his ult was still a very good late game tool for a funnel strategy, very similar to what we see today with something like a Master Yi and Taric. If Yorick is able to press R on a super fed carry on his team, his job is done, because even if his carry dies, they will have 10 more seconds to dish out damage and do their thing. Maybe some of the optimistic League of Legends fans thought that we would be treated with more Yorick picks after this game because they did win and they did beat Fnatic, but it was more of the same after that, because essentially nobody played this champion. He was easily the most unpopular champion in the game, right along with the likes of Urgot and Poppy, and all three of these champions have been reworked at this point. But that's not to say there wasn't at least one player who played him. In fact, there was a famous Yorick player who consistently got to Challenger, Inverted Composer. This guy has reached legendary status in the history of League of Legends because nobody else played Yorick at this time. Nobody else was playing Yorick at this incredibly high elo, but he did. How did he do it? Well, it was through a combination of incredible skill and game knowledge on the champion. You have to understand the champion perfectly, not just good enough, but perfectly. Also, the surprise factor of Yorick could begin to work in your favor, even against the best of the best challenger level pros. Because it was a once a year event to even see a Yorick in game, let alone have to lane against him, it was pretty easy to forget the strengths and the weaknesses of the champion. Challenger players would get dove under their tower by Yorick, and somewhat embarrassingly too, as you were now the guy on stream being the person who feeds against the worst champion in the game. This could easily tilt you and cause you to play even worse, and because Inverted Composer was good enough at the champion, if he did get his lead, he could usually close out the game and grab the win. He is one of the relics of this game, one of the OGs, and is the living example that no matter how many excuses you want to make and how bad you want to complain about certain champions, about your strategies being underpowered and off meta, it does not always have to limit you and your potential. But that story aside, where are we now? Well, if we look at Yorick's timeline of changes from late 2012 all the way to the end of 2016, 4 full years, this is a list of all of Yorick's changes. Yep, he was completely forgotten. This is all he got in 4 years. He was waiting to be revived by a rework. Funny enough, the gravedigger champion kind of needed to be dug out of his grave and revived just like his ghouls. Finally, on August 19th, 2016, we got our first teaser for the new reworked Yorick, just about 5 years after his original release. The hype around this rework at the time was super strong because of the fact that we all knew he was going to be reworked. It was just so long overdue that most players expected it to be epic. The champion spotlight and his trailer were awesome, and I felt that visually this is one of the better upgrades we've ever seen, right along with the Poppy rework. They did a very nice job of nailing his thematic and making him feel up to date with the modern games. In terms of his overall theme, I feel like it's a knock-up job. But what about his gameplay? Some thought it was pretty cool, and his popularity has obviously increased over the years because of the rework. It's very hard to not call this a successful update, Because if you compare it to what he was before, it's not all that hard. All they had to do was take the literal worst designed champion in the game and make him better. However, that does not mean that everyone is satisfied. For starters, once again, his champion spotlight was misleading. At 6 minutes, it's shown that Yorick is able to use his new Q on towers and inhibitors, not only for an auto attack reset, but also the bonus damage. But this was not a feature that was in his kit. In fact, it wasn't added until more than a year later in patch 7.22. And the community cited this as a massive buff where he will now destroy side lanes and push way too fast. But it seems like this was something that was already intended to be in his kit, we just never got it. Regardless, when he first came out, many players tried to pick up the champion thinking his playstyle would be so similar to the old Yorick, just with a fresh coat of paint and a more fair laning phase. But this wasn't the case at all. Gone were the mana items, the absurd laning phase, sustain, and war of attrition. Instead, he was all about late game split pushing and getting to the side lane. Yorick was also given most of his power into the champion instead of the ghouls, now known as Mistwalkers. They really only become powerful if you land your E, which is a skill shot, and even then, compared to his old ghouls, it's just not even close. Instead, his power budget is now aligned with his Q, acting just like some other powerful auto attack resets. This is his bread and butter, but chasing people down can still be a little difficult because you kind of need to land both your skill shots with your W and your E. Also, the Maiden is a bit awkward to use, but overall it's still a decent ultimate. The best part about it is the increased damage he gets when the Maiden and him attack the same target, and for many people this is where that surprise damage comes from when playing against Yorick. But in general in this game, honestly all of the pet features, Tibbers, Malzahar, and Yorick the Maiden, they just feel lackluster and feel like Riot has never been able to code them correctly. Yeah, we're talking about you, Daisy. Thanks to League of Graphs, we can see Yorick's popularity by year, and you can see the champion has become more popular with the update, where he almost always hovered around 1% or even less pre-rework. The first big spike obviously came with the new update because every champion becomes more popular after a shiny new kit. But what about this second bump, which nearly doubles after he was reworked? What happened to bring him to this by far all-time high 9% popularity? During the early parts of Season 9, several pro top laners picked up Yorick as he began to dominate solo queue. Guys like Wonder, Tall, and Dokla realized that both Conqueror and Grasp of the Undying were awesome runes for him to take, and the sustain and split pushing of the champ was unmatched for a top laner. Oftentimes you could win the game by yourself, even with a bad KDA, so long as you got out of laning phase and you were able to split push to victory. And for a while he was seen as a hidden OP pick.
He was out of frustration.
Yorick Morris gonna end the game.
Exactly. And Tal says, I'm playing by myself. Come here, Maiden, let's go. And that's the kills just flying forward for Hanwha. This series is over. The 2-0 for Hanwha Life Esports reinvigorated after the Lunar New Year break.
Oh, praise Yorick. He comes back after 5.5 years. Up and down.
Looks for the distort, looks for the signal of malice, gets the chains, not done yet. There goes the ghouls, and Wonder sends up a dagger packing.
The game, Acadian, a 3-man smoke screen. Landers by, pops the stop one. They need to buy time. Power of Evil, getting low. Here comes the TP back, but I think Dokla, he's able to solo down these turrets. Cancels the TP, and Dokla, he's gonna do all the work himself. Takes down Golden Guardian's Nexus. They're gonna give Optic their win.
This is by far the most we had ever seen of this champion at the highest level, and during Season 9 he racked up a 15% presence, with more than 200 bans and 100 picks. If those numbers don't shock you, well, take a look at every other season from Season 4 until now. However, if you look, his win rate was okay for competitive. He hovered right around a 50% win rate, which is still totally respectable, and meant that at the very least he was a strong and solid champion. You have to be a very good champion and a strong champion in solo queue in order to have a 50% win rate over that many games at the highest level of play. But then we saw some repeated nerfs to Yorick. These were significant enough to push him out of favor, and now he's not even seen at the highest level anymore. He's become much less popular overall, and his win rate in solo queue is nowhere near where it used to be. Riot's balancing of this champion has come under fire quite a bit because of how they've tried to balance him in the lower ranks versus the higher ranks. The general pattern for this champion is that he seems overbearing and way too powerful in lower ranks when people don't know what to do about his split pushing, when they often die to him because the ghouls wreck them, and they don't know what the ult does, and he seems to win quite a bit because the games on average go much longer. This causes his weaker early game and lack of a lot of good matchups to not be as relevant. He has posted some record high win rates in lower tiers, which has caused Riot to nerf him several times for this reason, but I feel as if these changes are not just a crime to Yorick, but in a broader scope, a very problematic way to change and balance any competitive game. On 8.17, we got a nerf to Yorick, but it is the wording that bothers me the most. Top laners have unearthed Yorick as a dominant pick, in part due to the threat of his Mistwalkers. Players who understand the Mistwalkers' behavior and actively play around it avoid a lot of damage, while players who don't find themselves digging their own graves. We're toning down the damage of Mistwalkers to decrease his low-level pubstomp potential. The problem is that they use a lack of understanding from the players as a reason to go ahead and make changes. They say themselves his power doesn't seem excessively strong for players who know how the champion works. This is for players who aren't good enough, so they get punished. Their aim was to make things easier to play against because the opposition doesn't understand why they're bad, so let's just make them less bad. This is frustrating as a player of League of Legends and in general, not just for Yorick players, because I'm not one. When developers openly admit that the only reason they're making a change is because some players aren't learning and aren't good at the game, and that's not fun for them, well, I would have to say that's probably the worst way to go about designing a game. I am not good at Counter-Strike. I only have put in about 50 hours into the game, and I can't handle the AK. I haven't learned and mastered its recoil pattern, and I don't understand the gun even a fraction of the way that a professional does. But that doesn't make it right for Valve to just fix the AK for me, and make it have pinpoint accuracy and no recoil pattern, because that's part of the learning curve of the game. Only a small fraction of the old school RuneScape player base has bested the Inferno, one of the hardest PvM or PvE challenges in any MMO. What makes it so difficult is the longevity of the fight, the massive gear requirement to even stand a chance, and the deep understanding of the mechanics and its waves. Just because I can't do an Inferno does not mean that Jagex should just make it easier so I can get an Infernal cape. You're riding a dangerous line because you don't necessarily want to say too bad get good, but at the same time you sort of have to. Because what is the purpose of the game and of the champion if learning him isn't rewarding enough and learning how to be good against him isn't even punishing? I don't think Riot has done a completely horrible job with Yorick. In fact, some of the buffs and quality of life changes that he's been given are not the worst things they could have done. I just don't think that this approach is what's fair. Ultimately, I'm not a game developer, nor am I a game designer with 200 years of collective experience. But I have an honest question to ask then. If it's perfectly okay to say a champion is way too pub-stompy, what do you do about champions that only dominate at the highest level? Akali clearly needs buffs for lower elo, as she rocks the single lowest win rate in the game for silver and gold. But of course, they can't do that because players would see that she's too problematic for professional play and the pros would run rampant. But in the first example with Yorick, the lower rated players were the ones being addressed, and a champion was nerfed because they dominated lower ranks. But why would weaker champions in lower elo not be buffed? When you're strictly talking about buffing champions, why is it the professionals that get preferential treatment, but when it comes to nerfing champions, it's actually the lower rated players that get treated? Learning and improving in this game and feeling like you finally overcame something that you were struggling to beat is what makes all of these games interesting. Just waiting for a champion to be nerfed, rather than doing everything you can to learn how to play against it and come up with some counter strategy, is way more interesting than spamming refresh on surrender at 20, hoping for new nerfs. Maybe all along, that's what we did wrong with the original Yorick too. You see, at the very beginning of this story, I told you that the old Yorick was the most broken and unfair champion to lane against in the game's history. I told you it was a good thing that he was locked away by nerfs. I told you the champion should have been buried, and he was. Riot was so ashamed of the champion they didn't even want you to try him. They knew that he was broken, and so badly needed a fully reworked kit. And I mostly do agree with that. But I also mentioned that in today's game, maybe he wouldn't have been that strong, because a good Lee Sin or a good Nidalee jungler might have just camped the Yorick to counter him. And that got me thinking. What if this Yorick nerf and Riot's philosophy of nerf him because players are too bad to play against him wasn't all that different from the original kit? What if we were all just too bad at the game to beat him? What if there was something that we didn't think of? What if we didn't try every single matchup to try to find his counter? This was so long ago at this point. Players were much worse at the game. Is Yorick, both in his original state and this one, the premier example of why game developers should have a more hands-off approach, a living proof in two completely different yet shockingly similar examples of why we should buff rather than nerf? The Yorick theory. Why get good is always the best way to balance your game. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.